happened back in 1991. 4 teenage girls were found shot and killed in a yogurt shop. Police have now identified a suspect through DNA, and he is a serial killer.
A warning to our viewers. What you are about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
It's just before midnight on December 6, 1991, in Austin, Texas, and a police patrolman driving past a small strip mall on Anderson Lane notices flames coming from a storefront. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now before we continue, because this channel covers a new solved cold case every single week, and this is one of the most devastating ones in American history. The building is home to an "I can't believe it's yogurt" shop, a small frozen yogurt store tucked into a strip mall in North Austin, the kind of unremarkable, brightly lit teenage hangout spot that exists in nearly every American suburb. The sort of place where high schoolers work their first jobs, scooping toppings and closing registers, where nothing more dramatic than a slow Friday night shift is ever supposed to happen. Inside, working the closing shift that night, are 17-year-old Eliza Thomas and 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison, two friends and co-workers finishing up the kind of routine, unremarkable evening that thousands of teenagers across the country are having at the exact same moment. As closing time approaches, Jennifer's younger sister, 15-year-old Sarah Harbison, and their close friend, 13-year-old Ayers, arrive at the shop to meet them and head home together. An ordinary Friday night routine for 4 teenage girls who know each other well, planning nothing more eventful than a ride home after a shift, the kind of small, familiar plan repeated in millions of American households every single weekend. Quick question while we're here. Where are you watching this from, and what's the weather like there tonight? Drop it in the comments. It's almost unbearable to think this happened on what should have been an unremarkable Friday night, 4 girls simply waiting to close up a yogurt shop and go home to their families. Firefighters arrive to battle the blaze and begin working to bring it under control, pushing through smoke and heat with no idea yet of what waits for them inside. As they push deeper into the building, they make a discovery that will haunt the city of Austin for decades. Inside, they find the bodies of all 4 girls, Eliza Thomas, Ayers, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison. Each of them has been shot in the head. Their hands were bound using their own clothing. Their mouths had been gagged with cloth. Ayers had been shot twice. The autopsy reports would later capture small, devastating details of the ordinary lives these girls had been living just hours before. Amy wearing small white earrings, Sarah wearing a gold necklace and a Mickey Mouse watch, Jennifer wearing her high school ring and a Timex watch, the kind of small, personal details that make the loss feel immediate and specific, rather than abstract. 4 real teenagers with real routines and real belongings, not simply 4 names on a case file. Whoever did this had set the store on fire afterward, an act that investigators quickly realized was almost certainly designed to destroy any physical evidence left behind. And it works devastatingly well. The fire consumes crucial forensic material before it can ever be properly collected, badly compromising the case investigators are about to spend the next 3 decades trying to solve, erasing potential fingerprints, physical traces, and anything else that might have offered an immediate answer in the hours after the crime. What that fire destroyed, and what one single overlooked piece of evidence sitting in a drain would eventually be capable of proving 34 years later, is the reason this case finally became the most consequential double miscarriage of justice in Texas history. Stay with us. The Austin Police Department responds with everything it has. A dedicated task force forms almost immediately, and the case quickly draws in state and federal resources, including the FBI, an unusual level of coordinated response reflecting just how deeply this crime shook the entire city from the moment it became public. Composite information, witness statements, and forensic material, what little of it survived the fire, get worked over relentlessly by investigators, desperate to identify who could have done this to 4 teenage girls in a location as ordinary and public as a strip mall yogurt shop. The case becomes an obsession not just for the department, but for the entire city of Austin. a community that finds itself confronting the reality that something this brutal happened in a place parents had considered completely safe, a well-lit, well-trafficked shopping center, rather than some isolated, obviously dangerous location. Just days after the murders, a young man named Maurice Pierce is arrested at a mall not far from the yogurt shop, found carrying a .22 caliber handgun, a weapon type consistent with what investigators believe may have been used in the killings. It's a promising early lead, the kind of break a case like this desperately needs. And for a moment, it seems like the case might resolve almost as quickly as it began. But it doesn't hold. Pierce is questioned and eventually released, and the case, despite the enormous resources thrown at it, begins the slow slide into a genuine cold case. Investigators wade through thousands of tips over the following years, each one requiring time and manpower to properly chase down and rule out. Multiple people falsely confess to the murders, as sometimes happens in high-profile cases that capture national attention. Confessions that have to be painstakingly investigated and ruled out each time, consuming resources and hope in equal measure, and ultimately producing nothing. Years pass. The case that once had an entire task force built around it slips further and further from resolution, becoming for the city of Austin one of the defining unsolved horrors of its recent history. A name that gets brought up at anniversaries, referenced in local news retrospectives, discussed by an entire generation of Austin residents who grew up hearing about it even if they were too young to remember the actual night it happened. Real quick, if this is the first case you've watched from us, let us know in the comments what state or country you're tuning in from. We genuinely read every one, and it helps us figure out what to cover next. Then, in 1999, nearly 8 years after the murders, the case appears to break wide open. Investigators arrest 4 men in connection with the killings: Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. All 4 had been teenagers themselves at the time of the murders, meaning that by the time of their arrest, they've spent years as adults living under the shadow of a case that first touched their lives when they were barely older than the victims themselves. The arrests bring a wave of relief to a city that had waited nearly a decade for any kind of resolution. A sense that finally, after so many years of dead ends and false confessions, someone would actually be held accountable. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott are ultimately tried and convicted, based heavily on confessions the 2 men gave during police interrogations. Long, intensive interviews that stretch across hours, producing statements that, at the time, seemed to investigators and prosecutors like exactly the breakthrough this case had been missing for the better part of a decade. For a moment, it seems like Austin finally has its answer. It doesn't hold either. The convictions unravel over the following years as serious questions emerge about the reliability of those confessions. Questions about coercion, about inconsistencies between what the men described and what forensic evidence actually showed, about the broader unreliability of confession-based prosecutions in cases involving intense public pressure to produce an arrest. Legal experts and advocates for the wrongly convicted would later point to this case as a textbook example of exactly how false confessions happen. Young, vulnerable suspects, hours of sustained interrogation, and an investigative team under enormous pressure to finally close a case that had haunted an entire city for the better part of a decade. In 2009, a judge orders both Springsteen and Scott released, after prosecutors themselves acknowledged that new DNA testing, technology that simply hadn't existed or wasn't sophisticated enough back in 1991, had revealed evidence pointing toward an entirely different, unidentified male suspect. Charges are ultimately dropped against all 4 men. 2 decades after 4 teenage girls were murdered, Austin doesn't have a convicted killer. It has 2 men who spent years in prison for a crime the evidence increasingly suggests they didn't commit, and a case that has now failed not once, but twice, to deliver a real answer. For the families, the Harbisons, the Thomases, the Ayers family, this second collapse is its own particular kind of devastation, arguably harder in some ways than the original decade of uncertainty, because it means confronting the possibility that even the resolution they'd been given, however imperfect, was itself built on nothing solid. Barbara Wilson, mother of Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, would later say plainly that all the family ever wanted, through all of it, was the truth. Instead, for years afterward, they're left with neither a confirmed killer nor even confidence that the men who had been prosecuted were guilty in the first place. An agonizing, unresolved limbo that stretches on for well over another decade, on top of the years the case had already consumed. A grief, compounded by uncertainty, rather than eased by any sense of resolution. The case reverts fully to unsolved status, and it stays that way for years, sustained largely by the DNA evidence recovered from the scene. The same evidence that had exonerated Springsteen and Scott, sitting in storage, technically preserved, but not yet matched to anyone. Advances in forensic DNA technology over the 2010s and early 2020s periodically raise hope that new testing methods might finally identify the unknown male profile, but for years, nothing produces a name. Detectives assigned to Austin's cold case unit periodically revisit the file, checking whether newer forensic techniques might finally succeed where earlier attempts had failed, each review coming up empty, each anniversary passing with the case exactly where it had been left. The Austin Police Department, to its credit, keeps working the file regardless. Our team never gave up working this case, the department would later say. A claim that, given how many decades and how many false starts this investigation had already endured, carries real weight. A small but meaningful acknowledgement that even a case this old and this painful never stopped being someone's active responsibility. The turning point arrives in 2025. And it comes together through a combination of newly available DNA testing, ballistic evidence, and old-fashioned, exhaustive police legwork. Investigators requesting and cross-referencing police reports from law enforcement agencies all over the country, hunting for any case, anywhere, that might connect to the unidentified profile recovered from the yogurt shop scene. That effort ramps up sharply beginning in June 2025. Driven in part by renewed public and departmental attention on the case, following the release of an HBO documentary series revisiting the murders that same year. A reminder of how often renewed public interest in a decades-old case can coincide with, or even help spur, the kind of dedicated investigative push that finally produces a breakthrough. Retired Austin Detective John Jones, one of the original investigators who worked the case from the very beginning, later reveals a detail that had sat quietly overlooked for over 3 decades. A bullet casing, recovered from a drain inside the yogurt shop at the time of the original investigation, that investigators believe is consistent with a firearm eventually tied to their new suspect. It's the kind of physical clue that had technically been in evidence storage the entire time, waiting for ballistic science and DNA testing to advance far enough, and for investigators to finally connect it to the right name. A small, easily overlooked object that ends up carrying enormous evidentiary weight once the right technology and the right cross-referencing finally catch up to it. That name is Robert Eugene Brashers. Brashers had never once appeared anywhere in 3.5 decades of investigation into the yogurt shop murders. He had no known ties to Austin, no documented connection to any of the 4 girls. Nothing that would have put him on any suspect list during any phase of this case's long, tortured history. Investigators eventually determine he's a serial killer and rapist responsible for at least 3 other murders committed between 1990 and 1998 across South Carolina and Missouri, along with the rape of a 14-year-old girl in 1997. He died by suicide in January 1999. The same year Austin police were arresting Springsteen, Scott, Pierce, and Wellborn for a crime, investigators now believe, none of those 4 men actually committed, during a standoff with law enforcement connected to an entirely separate incident, meaning the actual killer had already been dead for years by the time 2 innocent men were standing trial for his crime. Perhaps the most devastating detail investigators uncover is exactly whose DNA finally cracked the case open. Genetic material recovered from under 13-year-old Amy Ayers' fingernails, evidence that had sat preserved since the night of the murders, becomes the key piece of testing that eventually links back to Brashers. Austin Police cold case detective Daniel Jackson would later describe the significance of that evidence in devastating terms. Amy's final moments on this earth were to solve this case for us, Jackson says. It's because of her fighting back. A 13-year-old girl, in the last moments of her life, fighting for survival against a man who overpowered her anyway. And in doing so, leaving behind the single piece of evidence that would eventually identify him. 34 years too late for it to save her, but not too late to finally give her family and 3 other families an answer. It's an almost unbearable thing to sit with. The same instinct to fight back that couldn't save her life became, decades later, the exact thing that finally ended her killer's anonymity. On September 26 and 29, 2025, Austin police hold a series of announcements confirming what the DNA evidence has revealed. Robert Eugene Brashers, deceased since 1999, is responsible for the murders of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison. Investigators state clearly that, at this point, there's no evidence he had an accomplice, meaning that the 4 men originally arrested in 1999, 2 of whom served years in prison based on confessions investigators now understand to have been coerced or unreliable, had nothing whatsoever to do with what happened inside that yogurt shop. A conclusion that closes one chapter of this case while opening an entirely new reckoning over what had happened to those 4 men in the meantime. The consequences of this revelation move quickly. In December 2025, the Travis County District Attorney's Office files a motion to formally begin the exoneration process for Springsteen, Scott, Pierce, and Welburn. A legal acknowledgement, 34 years after the murders, and over 2 decades after their original arrests, that these 4 men had been wrongly pursued for a crime committed by someone with no connection to any of them. On February 19, 2026, a judge formally declares all 4 men innocent, closing out one of the most damaging wrongful prosecution sagas in Texas legal history. In May 2026, the city of Austin agrees to a $35 million settlement to be divided among the 4 men as some measure of compensation for years of their lives lost to an investigation that had, for a time, convinced itself it had the right suspects. A settlement that, however substantial, can never fully account for years spent incarcerated or reputations permanently altered by an accusation the evidence ultimately proved false. It's worth sitting with how narrow the margin actually was here, and how many separate failures compounded across 3.5 decades before this case finally closed. If the fire set inside the yogurt shop had burned even slightly longer, or slightly hotter, the biological evidence recovered from beneath Amy Ayers's fingernails, the single piece of forensic material that eventually broke this case open, might never have survived intact enough to test at all. If DNA technology hadn't advanced sufficiently by the 2020s to extract a usable profile from evidence collected in 1991, before modern forensic DNA science existed in any mature form, this case might still be sitting exactly where it sat for over 3 decades. Unsolved, with 2 men's wrongful convictions never fully investigated or overturned. If investigators hadn't pursued the exhausting, unglamorous work of cross-referencing police reports from law enforcement agencies across multiple states, Brashers, a man with no known ties to Austin, no reason for local investigators to ever look in his direction, might never have surfaced as a suspect at all. His connection to this case buried permanently beneath his connections to entirely separate crimes in South Carolina and Missouri. There's something almost unbearable about the shape of this particular case, distinct from so many other cold cases eventually solved through DNA. This wasn't simply a matter of technology finally catching up to evidence that had been waiting patiently in storage. This was a case where the system got it wrong not once, but twice. First in the 8 years of failing to identify any credible suspect at all, and then catastrophically in 1999, when intense pressure to finally produce an answer led investigators to extract confessions from young men who, evidence would eventually prove, had nothing to do with the crime. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott didn't just lose years of freedom to a wrongful conviction. They lost those years while the actual killer, a documented serial predator responsible for multiple other murders and assaults across multiple states, remained completely unidentified, dying by his own hand in 1999 without ever once being connected to the crime that would eventually define his legacy. It's a sobering reminder that a wrongful conviction doesn't just harm the person wrongly convicted. It actively works against ever finding the truth, consuming years of institutional attention and public closure on an answer that was never correct to begin with. For the families of Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison, the emotional arc of this case defies almost any comparison to a typical cold case resolution. They didn't simply wait decades for an answer. They waited nearly a decade for any suspect at all, then endured the wrenching experience of watching two young men convicted for their daughter's murders, then endured the collapse of those convictions, and years more of uncertainty about who, if anyone, would ever truly be held accountable, and finally, 34 years after the fire was first spotted on Anderson Lane, received an answer that came without a single living person left to prosecute. Barbara Wilson's words, that all the family ever wanted was the truth, carry a particular weight given just how long and how painfully that truth took to arrive, and how badly the system meant to deliver it had failed along the way. For a family grieving the loss of two daughters in a single night, every subsequent decade brought its own fresh wave of hope and disappointment, a grief that never got the chance to simply exist on its own terms, constantly reshaped by legal developments entirely outside their control. For the city of Austin, the yogurt shop murders became something far larger than a single unsolved crime over the more than 3 decades this case remained open. It became one of the defining traumas in the city's modern history, a case study in how badly intense public and institutional pressure to solve a horrific crime can distort an investigation, how easily confessions extracted under that pressure can collapse years later under real scrutiny, and how devastatingly long it can take for forensic science to finally catch up to evidence that was sitting, the entire time, in storage rooms and evidence drains, waiting for technology and persistence to finally converge. The case has been the subject of extensive media coverage for over 3 decades, including a recent HBO documentary series that brought renewed public attention to the murders in the months just before the final DNA breakthrough. Attention that, according to investigators, helped drive the final push of resources and cross-jurisdictional police work that ultimately identified Brashers. For an entire generation of Austin residents, this case functioned almost like a piece of shared civic memory, referenced at anniversaries, taught in local journalism and criminal justice courses, discussed by people who weren't even alive in 1991, but grew up understanding it as one of the formative tragedies of their city's recent past. Amy Ayers would be in her late 40s now, had she lived. Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison would be in their 50s. 4 young lives, ended on an ordinary Friday night in a strip mall yogurt shop, took 34 years to receive anything resembling a real answer, and even now, that answer arrives without a courtroom, without a trial, without the kind of public reckoning most families of murder victims eventually get to witness, because the man responsible has been dead since 1999, having taken his own life during an entirely unrelated standoff, never once held accountable in life for what he did to 4 teenage girls in Austin, Texas. What Amy Ayers left behind, in the final moments of an unimaginable ordeal, was the one piece of evidence patient enough and preserved carefully enough to eventually name him anyway. A final, defiant act that, 34 years later, finally gave 4 families the truth they had spent more than 3 decades fighting to receive. We're tracking several other cold cases with equally complicated, decades-long paths to resolution like this one, and we'll bring you the next story the moment it's ready, but only to people already subscribed when it happens. Hit subscribe now, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and we'll see you in the next one.